Good evening, good people of the snow. This is Ben Vandenbos with the Sawtooth Avalanche Center with your weekend update for December 17th, 2021. As a general reminder, these weekend updates are not meant to replace our avalanche forecasts. We put out forecasts by 7:30 a.m. every morning, mountain weather forecasts by about 5:30 in the morning or 6 in the morning. And those avalanche forecasts are our primary product. Those are the where we spend most of our effort, most of our time, and most of our thought. So when you're going out into the backcountry, it's important that you check those forecasts. The intention of these weekend updates is to give you a framework to kind of understand what you're reading in the forecast, particularly if you're working during the week and you're just getting out on the weekends and you kind of want to get caught up on what happened in the world of snow. That's what this is for, and yeah, hope that you find that it's useful. So let's dive right in. It's been a pretty exciting week in our neck of the woods. This photo here we are looking at we're at the near the Avalanche Center office here, looking at the row of trucks that got absolutely buried by the atmospheric river that impacted our area this week. It started on Saturday, started kind of trickling in snow early in the day on Saturday, really picked up steam for Saturday and Sunday in our northern mountains, Banner Summit area, Western Smokies, and the Sawtooths. And then the pattern of that focus kind of shifted on Monday and into Tuesday when we saw really significant precipitation in our southern areas. There was a little narrow stream of moisture in the atmosphere called an atmospheric river, kind of clipping Northern California and coming up our way. The effects of that river were being amplified by a low that was sitting off the west coast of the US. And that's one of the magic patterns for forming these big storms for our area. And I think we were all pretty happy to see it because it had been a little bit rough leading up to it. Looking here at this photo, this is a photo that I took on the 2nd of December up on Morgan Ridge. That's just to the east of Ketchum, just to the south of Trail Creek. And you can see, and I'm sure most of you remember, that everything was looking a lot browner than it does now. There was a little bit of remnant snow cover up high on shaded aspects, middle and upper elevations, and even some sunny aspects once you got high enough. But aspects that directly face the sun had really pretty well melted off up to at least about 9,000 feet or even a bit higher. We saw some really warm temperatures this fall, and that cooked that big storm that we got in late October and left us with not a ton of snow on the ground. So fast forward a little bit, 4 days of storm, and all of a sudden from that same location, or from the same location that photo was taken, this is the view that you're getting. We went from basically zero to 100 in just a couple of days there. And as I'm sure that you've noticed, unless you're living under a rock with your eyes closed, everything is white around here now. We've got a pretty significant snowpack that formed in just a couple of days. And just like the way that the mountains look changed, the way that the avalanche hazard has changed. Here I am sitting in that pit that I dug up there on Morgan Ridge on the 2nd of December, wondering what am I doing here? What is this? Am I supposed to call this thing a snowpack? There was less than a foot of snow on the ground here where there was snow, and you really had to climb up high to get it. It's about 8,300, 8,200 feet. And I think this is the first snow pit I've ever dug in my tennis shoes. Just kind of a heartbreaker. At the Avalanche Center, we spent the first half of the month of December running around the mountains and trying to get a handle for what the snow that was on the ground looked like, how it was behaving, particularly as we got into some colder temperatures leading up to this storm. And what we were seeing wasn't super pretty. Then we threw that storm on top of it. So this photo is taken in almost the exact same place. This was yesterday. Chris and I were out on Morgan Ridge. We went back to see how that new snow was behaving on top of the old snow. So just, in the span of just a couple of days, we go from having a very thin snowpack to having basically snow everywhere. And we've gotten to the point where it's actually quite hard. It snowed enough that it's quite hard to tell where there was and wasn't snow before that storm. And I'll come back to that. First, a little note about snowpack assessment. How do we assess the snowpack? Is it here we got a photo of Chris. He looks like he's kind of reaching down and kind of feels around with his hands a little bit and makes some sort of proclamation about the snowpack stability. Well, it's a little more complex than that. There's a lot of things that go into deciding snowpack to stability and trying to assess that, but certainly getting our hands into the ground is one of them. When we have big storm events like we just had, a really important thing is to look for the pattern of avalanche activity. And in some ways, this is often the easiest thing. If we throw 3 or 4 or 5 inches of water like we did just now on top of a weak snowpack, and we watch to see where we find avalanches, we get a pretty good sense for how the snowpack that was on the ground is going to behave. It's not a forward-looking test. It's a real world test. We tested the snowpack by putting it on there, and then we see what happens. And the results weren't terribly surprising. As we've traveled around the mountains, we've been able to find lots of avalanches that look like this one. This is in Prairie Creek. This is an east and southeast facing slope, a little under 10,000 feet. And you can see an avalanche, a few avalanches here that likely failed about the same time near the tail end of that storm, each of them breaking hundreds of feet wide. One thing that's been really interesting with this storm, though, is that it snowed so hard and there was so much continual wind through a lot of the storm that it's actually been kind of hard to find some of these avalanches. Avalanches that failed right at the tail end of the storm are quite obvious. You can see big crowns like this and big debris piles. But avalanches that failed a little early in the storm, and then it continued to snow on them and the wind continued to blow, and it kind of complicate that a little bit. This next photo here, you can, if you look closely in kind of the center of the frame there, you can see some kind of the side of the avalanche, what we call a stock wall. And you can see a little bit of debris, kind of a little bit of a texture to the snow, but it's a little bit harder to see exactly that there was an avalanche there. And if that had happened a bit earlier, it's even harder to see. Here's another great example of that. This is in Baker Creek. And if you look in the sun there below that, you can see a pretty obvious pile of debris. But if you look real close where the crown would be, it's pretty hard to find the crown. And that's been the case with a number of these. So, but I guess the take home point here is that as we go around and look for this pattern of activity, it's been a little bit complicated by the storm, but there is a pretty prominent pattern that's sticking out. And that pattern is kind of an old snow versus new snow pattern, where we're finding slopes that had snow before the storm, even just a tiny bit, like the one at the beginning of the slope presentation. Those are much more suspect than slopes that didn't have snow before the storm. Put another way, where this storm fell on dirt, we have much better stability than where it fell on older snow. And that seems like a pretty easy black and white sort of thing, but it's actually a bit more complex than you might think. And I'll come back to that. So how do we deal with a big storm like this? What do we do when we see stuff like that? Well, we take a couple of steps back, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 big steps back, let the storm play out, look for the pattern of activity, and ski and ride on low angle slopes free of avalanche hazard. You can see this photo here. As that pattern of activity becomes a little bit more obvious, we're able to say things with a bit more confidence about the snowpack and how we expect it to behave now, today, tomorrow, and looking forward into the future. Right now, the pattern that we're seeing, there are 2 main patterns that we're seeing. We've got two pretty different snowpacks in the mountains, and those are in places where we had snow before that storm and places that we didn't have snow before this storm. This photo, we're up on top of Baldy. We're looking north out towards Baker Creek, out towards the Fox Peak area. And you can see these really prominent, it's almost like kind of a zebra stripe pattern. One side of these ridges have snow and the other side didn't have snow. This pattern is really obvious right now as we look at this photo, But when we throw a couple of feet of snow on that, that pattern changes a lot. And that's one thing that's making what seems to be a very simple pattern of the snowpack being better where there was no snow before versus where there was snow before a bit more complicated. Because actually identifying if you're on a slope or if you're going to go onto a slope that had snow or didn't have snow is more complex than you might think. The main thing that we're concerned about is that old snow at this point. We really haven't seen these slopes where it's just dirt, was dirt before the storm and is nice solid snowpack just from the one storm above it. We haven't seen a lot of issues on those slopes, or really any issues. And folks have been starting to step out into that sort of terrain, and we haven't really seen any negative results because of that. Does that mean that those slopes are 100% safe? No, it's never possible to say that with 100% confidence, but doesn't mean that it's much safer on slopes that didn't have snow than those that did. Yes. And while that seems like a pretty simple message, and it is, that can change from one turn to the next, or from one pull of your thumb to the next as you climb a slope or ski down a ridge like this, and you're turning left and you've got nothing underneath you except the new snow, and on the other side of the ridge you've got this old weaker snow near the ground. You're encountering these two very different snowpacks, and you, unless you have paid a bunch of attention leading up to this, it may not be inherently obvious which that you're traveling in and how it's going to behave. You also have a variation within the old snow itself, where these slopes that were a little bit more solar, that got a little bit more sun before that storm, but are still holding snow, were icy and crusty, and they're kind of cooked down, and they're real slick, and those can be weak surfaces, and we've seen a few avalanches on those slopes. But really where the problem is at its worst, appears to be at its worst, is on these shaded slopes at middle and upper elevations, where we've had a snowpack that's been sitting there and hanging out there for almost 2 months now. And as you wrap around from a slope that faces south, that's dry or has an icy crust, to those solar margins kind of on the eastern and western half of the compass, sides of the compass, and you have these crust and facet combos, and all the way around to the north where you have crust and facets, but the stack of facets are significantly thicker. You're seeing that those slopes are behaving differently. And again, you can't tell that visually looking at it without digging down to it. And even if you dig down to it, a single pit does not necessarily tell you how exactly an entire slope is going to behave. So even though this picture is somewhat simple, and we're seeing people step out into this sort of terrain that's been dry without any results, it's complex in that it's hard to tell what slope you might be on unless you've been watching it for the entire season already. So what are we doing about this? Well, skiing low angle stuff is always a great option. Stepping out into steeper terrain that didn't have snow before is significantly safer than stepping out into terrain that did have snow. We've got this pretty significant variation in danger. When you're reading the avalanche forecast, what we're describing to you is the danger on these slopes where things are very dangerous. It's a challenging message to be sending, and it's a challenging message to be dealing with in the backcountry. And it's not necessarily something that we deal with every season because of that really warm weather that we had leading up to this, leading to the snowfall event that started this week. That really made a really dramatic amount of variability from slope to slope. Okay, looking forward to the weekend. What are we going to get this weekend? Looking like Saturday is going to be partly sunny day, and maybe a few more clouds on Sunday and some trickles of snow. We'll see that this weather isn't likely to affect the stability of the snowpack, and because of that, we're giving this weak layer a little bit of time to heal. But these types of weak layers don't heal quickly. They stick around for quite some time, and the the likelihood of triggering avalanches involving that weak snow, if you're on particularly shaded aspects at middle and upper elevation, is just kind of lingering. It slowly comes down, but if the likelihood is a 2 in 10 chance one day and a 1.5 in 10 chance the next day, neither of those are particularly great options. So we're seeing that danger slowly come down, or that likelihood slowly come down, but that's a very gradual process, and all these little bumps of snow that we've been getting along the way are keeping that snowpack a bit more reactive, not giving those weak layers time to heal like we'd like them to. And we're pretty confident at this point that we're going to be dealing with this problem for at least a bit of time looking into the future. It's not a here today, gone tomorrow problem. It's a here today and it's here tomorrow too. But as you can see, fortunately there are options. The skiing and the riding right now are quite fantastic, and in a lot of ways they're actually better on these low angle slopes, particularly as we get sunny days like this that start to add crust to the snowpack. Those crusts are forming on steeper slopes because the sun's quite low in the sky. When the sun is low, it only directly impacts, or it's only putting a great crust on those slopes that are a lot steeper. Those low angle slopes, you're kind of seeing a glancing blow across there, and so because of that, we have these lingering good skiing and good riding conditions, and that's something that we can do safely, which is a pretty fantastic option. After all, it's only mid-December, and we were spending a lot of time staring at the ground just a week ago. So it's pretty worthwhile to remember that even though we have this persistent problem that we're dealing with, and that's going to be around for a while, we do have a lot of good options, though they are, like I've been trying to make pretty clear, it is not necessarily obvious where there was and wasn't old snow, and being really cognizant of that fact is pretty important. I tried to drum up a few questions from a few different folks. Looking into the future with this weekend update, I think it'd be interesting to do this sort of thing where we have more questions from you guys, because I know everybody has questions about the snowpack, and our job is to answer those for you. But I've got a couple of questions here that I've addressed a little bit, but we'll dive into a little bit more, and if hopefully it's a little bit helpful for you. 2 questions we're going to cover is, what are these cold temperatures doing to the snowpack, and how do we think about stepping out when we have this sort of a problem, or this sort of a setup in the snowpack? Well, the cold temperatures create strong temperature gradients at the surface of the snowpack and throughout the snowpack in thin snowpacks. Fortunately, in most of our areas, our snowpack is 3 feet deep now, or deeper. In fact, Chris was out in the Beaver Creek drainage today, and he was finding a snowpack that was over 4 feet deep, 4.5 feet deep in places. When those snowpacks get deeper, the temperature gradients that we're putting on those are a little bit weaker, and so we're not seeing the snowpack trend to facets, or we're not seeing it weaken because of those temperatures. But we still develop these strong temperature gradients near the surface of the snowpack. That means that the surface of the snowpack is getting weaker as time passes, and when we start to put more of a load on the snow, we're likely to see, if this weather continues, we're likely to see that's not necessarily going to be a stable conformation, at least in the short term. So that, I think that addresses the cold temperature aspect of it. The other interesting thing that we have going on right now is it is sunny, particularly today, the first real day of sun. We had some sun Thursday as well, and we're going to see some sun tomorrow, Saturday as well. Temperatures stay pretty cool. The sun, as I mentioned, is low in the sky, and so the combination of those cold temperatures, that low sun angle, which means that the solar radiation is a little less intense, is forming a pretty unique, relatively unique layer right now called a radiation recrystallization crust. And when that happens, the air is cold enough and the sun doesn't have enough power to melt the surface of the snow. However, just underneath the surface of the snow, where the solar radiation is still getting in and affecting it, it's capable of melting it and building a crust. If you're out in the backcountry, you'll find something like this by, maybe you're walking along and you notice that all of a sudden you're in crusty snow. Look closer to the surface, and if the surface isn't melted, and you have a little bit of dry grains and dry snow on top of that, you've found one of these crusts. It's a pretty interesting process, but unfortunately, it can form a pretty pesky weak layer. Hard to say if that's going to stick around or not. At this point, it looks like that probably will be getting buried. That varies from aspect to aspect, and that's going to add even more complexity to the picture that I'm trying to describe. So as we move forward through time, and these patterns are overprinted on top of these other patterns, we have more complexity, which means that traveling safely in the backcountry and being able to identify the hazard posed or the existence of a weak layer on the slope that you're recreating becomes a bit trickier. Keeping track of these things as we go along is a great way to help yourself hopefully identify if that's a layer that might be on a slope that you're looking at skiing or riding on. The other question that we're hearing a lot about is a question about when does this get better, and when can we step out into bigger avalanche terrain? And I'll tell you that as somebody who loves spending time in avalanche terrain when it's appropriate, that question's on the forefront of my mind, but the answer isn't necessarily the most satisfying one. When we have weak layers like this, we deal with them for quite some time, and they can be hard to deal with mentally, because what we want to do is go get out into these areas. And that's why you guys are sitting here listening to what I'm saying. We're interested in going into the backcountry and traveling through avalanche terrain safely, and answering that question of, is this a good time to do that or not, can be quite hard with these sorts of weak layers. At this point, conditions are quite dangerous where this weak layer exists, and your likelihood of triggering an avalanche on a steep enough slope where this weak layer exists is pretty good, and that's certainly a great odds game to be playing. So best advice for that is to kind of wait and see watch how that weak layer behaves over time, and that's what we're here for. We're out digging pits and looking at the snow every day, watching that transition, hopefully trending towards stability eventually, but monitoring that by the day. I guess I give you a little piece of optimism. We're not at a point where it's all over, where we're just gonna have this forever and we can never go ski and ride in these places that we want to. But we're definitely not at the point where that weakness or that instability is healed and it's all right to go anywhere. So yeah, looking forward. Keep in mind the high degree of spatial variability that we have between slopes that had snow before this and didn't have snow before that. We also have a pattern of spatial variability within that old snow, depending on what aspect you're on. And we're overprinting another pattern of on the surface right now that we're eventually going to bury. At this point, it looks pretty promising that we're going to get, maybe another foot of snow, 8 inches to 10 inches, 12 inches of snow a little before Christmas. We're going to bury another potential weak layer or another interface to be monitoring, but we're also going to get some more snow for good skiing and riding. So it's early in the season. A lot of this isn't written yet. Nothing is decided. Who knows what it'll look like in a month, but there's plenty of reason to be optimistic at this point. There's good skiing and riding to be had on low angle slopes, and keep in mind that it's easy to switch between a slope that's much safer because it doesn't have old snow and a slope that's much less safe because it does have old snow. So I think that gives you a few ideas to take into the weekend. Again, I'll emphasize that this is not a replacement for our forecast. Chris is going to be up quite early tomorrow in the morning, writing a forecast for you guys to read. That'll be out by 7:30. That'll give you more details on what you need to know and what you're going to expect on that day and again on Sunday. So yeah, tune into those. Let us know what you're seeing out there. Importantly, anything that you tell us is important. We use that to incorporate that into our mental model and help to hopefully create something that helps you travel in the places that you want to be. So thanks for tuning in. Sorry for being a bit long-winded tonight, and hope you have a fantastic, safe weekend. Find lots of safe, sunny, soft snow to recreate in, and yeah, let us know what you see. Thanks a lot.